I walked into my own headquarters dressed like a stranger, only for the front desk manager to threaten me with security and try to steal my life's work. He had no idea that beneath my plain jumpsuit, I held the master key to a system that was about to turn this entire building into his personal prison. The air conditioning in the lobby of the Apex Tower hummed with a clinical, expensive sound that usually made me feel at home. I'd spent the last 3 years turning this company from a struggling boutique firm into an industry juggernaut. Today I was dressed in a casual charcoal jumpsuit, my undercover attire, because I wanted to see how the front of house staff treated our newer clients without the buffer of my executive assistant. I had my hair in a loose, natural protective style, and my face was free of the heavy corporate makeup I usually wore for board meetings. To anyone walking through the glass doors, I was just another person in the building. I approached the reception desk, wanting to check on the delivery status of a luxury prototype that was supposed to arrive by noon. The manager, a man named Greg who had been hired through a third-party agency just 2 months prior, didn't even look up from his phone. He had a look of permanent, bored irritation etched into his features. I cleared my throat, waiting for him to acknowledge me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm looking for a shipment log for the 10th floor arrivals. Could you pull that up for me?" Greg flicked his eyes up, scanned my face, and then looked me up and down with an expression that curdled my blood. It wasn't just boredom anymore. It was pure, unadulterated condescension. "Delivery guys use the service entrance in the back, sweetheart. This is the front lobby for clients and authorized personnel. You're clearly in the wrong place." "I am exactly where I need to be," I replied, my posture straightening. "I'm not a courier. I need to verify the delivery. Just pull up the digital log." Greg chuckled, a hollow sound that drew the attention of a few people waiting in the lounge. He stood up, towering over the desk, as if he were trying to intimidate me into leaving. "Look, I've had a long morning, and I'm not in the mood for games. You're loitering. You're not a tenant. And frankly, you're making the guests uncomfortable. If you don't step out of the building right now, I'm going to have security escort you out. And trust me, you don't want to be trespassed from a building this prestigious." I felt a cold fire ignite in my chest. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too many nights and weekends to be dismissed like a nuisance in my own headquarters. "I'm not going anywhere, Greg. I'm an owner here, and I suggest you rethink your tone before you make a decision you can't walk back from." Greg laughed out loud, slapping his hand on the desk. A few other employees in the lobby glanced over, some looking awkward, others smirking. "An owner? Right. And I'm the King of England. Security! We've got a situation at the front desk. Someone thinks they own the place." Two large security guards emerged from the hallway, their faces set in grim lines of duty. As they approached, I didn't back down. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen, opening the private equity dashboard that held the master deed to the building. I wasn't just a partner, I was the primary stakeholder. I stared directly at Greg, my heart hammering against my ribs, ready to unleash the storm I had been brewing for months. "You really want to play this game?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're about to regret every word you've said today." As the security guards reached for their radios, I held my phone up, displaying the red-lettered administrative access that flashed across the screen. The signal that the entire building's management system was now under my direct control. The lobby lights suddenly dimmed to a deep, ominous violet, and the elevator doors in the main hall began to cycle open and closed in a rhythmic, jarring pattern. Greg's face went from smug amusement to a pale, trembling mess of confusion. "What did you do?" he stammered, his hand hovering over his own security badge. "I told you," I said, stepping toward him as the guards hesitated, sensing something was wrong. "I don't just own this building. I own the contract you're about to be fired from. And if you think this is bad, wait until you see what happens when the legal team gets a hold of the audio recording of you calling your employer a trespasser." Just as Greg opened his mouth to stutter a protest, a heavy metallic slam echoed through the lobby. Every door in the building locked simultaneously with a loud, final thud, sealing us inside. The alarm system began to blare a low, mournful tone, and then the main monitor behind the desk flickered to life, showing my full name and title in bold white letters, followed by a live feed of the security footage recording Greg's exact behavior. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. And as the entire lobby turned to look at the screen, Greg realized his career was over. But he wasn't the only one who realized it. From the shadows of the hallway, a man in a sharp gray suit stepped out. Someone I hadn't seen in weeks, holding a file that looked significantly more dangerous than a termination letter. The man in the gray suit was Elias Thorne, my firm's chief of operations. He didn't look like he was here to handle a simple HR dispute. His face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic steel. He walked toward the reception desk with a gait that silenced the room. The lobby, usually bustling with the frantic energy of a tech hub, had fallen into an eerie, suffocating stillness. Even the security guards, who moments ago had been moving to physically remove me, stood frozen, their hands hovering near their belts as they recognized the gravity of Elias's presence. "Mr. Thorne," Greg started, his voice cracking, his previous arrogance replaced by a frantic, high-pitched desperation. I had no idea. She wouldn't present her badge, and she was causing a scene, claiming she was the owner. I was just following protocol." Elias didn't even glance at Greg. He kept his eyes locked on mine, a subtle nod of recognition passing between us. He reached the desk and set a leather-bound folder down on the granite surface with a heavy thud. It wasn't a standard document file. The embossed seal on the front belonged to the city's Corporate Regulatory Commission. My stomach dropped. I had suspected Greg was incompetent, but I hadn't realized he was a symptom of something much deeper. "We have a problem," Elias said, his voice low and vibrating with tension. "It isn't just about his treatment of you, Sarah. The internal audit we started 3 weeks ago, we found the source of the data leaks. And it's not coming from a rogue employee in the basement. It's coming from the Administrative Oversight Office." He opened the folder to reveal a series of printed emails and transaction logs. My eyes scanned the documents and my breath hitched. These weren't just petty thefts or resume padding. This was a sophisticated, organized scheme to siphon off our research data and sell it to our competitors. Greg was sweating profusely now, his eyes darting toward the exits, but the doors were still locked tight, held firm by the override code I'd triggered. "Is his name on these?" I asked, pointing to a highlighted line at the bottom of a transfer request. "He's the facilitator," Elias replied, finally looking at Greg. "He didn't just insult you, Sarah. He was hired by a competitor specifically to ensure that the security protocols were weak enough for them to walk in and out of the server room whenever they pleased. He wasn't just managing the front desk, he was managing their access." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The delivery I had come to check on wasn't a prototype. It was a Trojan horse, a hardware bypass device intended to gain permanent root access to our entire proprietary network. Greg had been trying to get me to leave so he could finalize the installation while the building was cleared. Greg let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "You think you're so smart? You think you own this place? You're a pawn, just like the rest of them. By the time you get the police here, the entire network will have finished the upload. Everything you've built, the patents, the code, the client lists, it's already gone. You don't own a company anymore. You own a shell." I didn't panic. I turned back to the console behind the desk, my fingers flying across the keys. I wasn't just an owner. I was a software engineer by trade, and I had designed the architecture of this building's security system myself. If the upload was active, there had to be a bottleneck. I began isolating the server clusters, cutting off external traffic segment by segment. "Elias, kill the main hub," I commanded. "If I do that, the system will wipe the core drive," Elias warned, his hand poised over the emergency cutoff. "We'll lose 6 months of work." "It's either that or they take it all," I said, staring at the monitor as the progress bar for the theft hit 98%. "Do it now!" Just as Elias slammed his hand onto the switch, a blinding flash of white light erupted from the server room behind the lobby wall, followed by the screeching alarm of a fire suppression system. The ceiling panels rattled as something massive struck the main door from the outside. Someone was trying to break in, and they weren't waiting for the police. The glass in the lobby shattered inward, and the lobby plunged into total, pitch-black darkness, save for the flickering red of the emergency lights. In the chaos, I heard a heavy thud right behind me. A hand, gloved and cold, grabbed my arm, yanking me away from the console just as the floor seemed to give way beneath us. I hit the ground hard, gasping for air, and as my vision cleared, I saw Greg standing over me, no longer looking frightened. He held an object in his hand that wasn't a key card. It was a digital decryption key, glowing with a soft, pulsing blue light, and he was smiling. "You were right about one thing, Sarah," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have come here today, because now you're the only person who knows how to open the vault, and we aren't leaving until you give us the final code." Before I could scream, the lobby speakers crackled to life, playing a looped, distorted recording of my own voice, making it sound like I was authorizing a full system lockdown and the destruction of all proprietary assets. A message popped up on the lobby screen. Evidence of corporate sabotage identified, calling the authorities. But the call wasn't going to the police. It was going directly to the Internal Security Board, and they had been primed to believe I was the one trying to destroy the company. I looked up at the security cameras, realizing they were now recording me in a compromising position, with the destroyed server room behind me and Greg acting the part of the victim. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. We're watching." The air in the lobby was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and ozone. My heart was thundering against my ribs, not just from the adrenaline, but from the terrifying realization of how deep this trap went. Greg hadn't just been hired to provide access. He had been hired to frame me. If the Internal Security Board saw that feed, if they saw me appearing to sabotage my own infrastructure, the legal repercussions would be catastrophic. I was looking at a potential attempt to break my life with a heavy charge of corporate fraud. "You're clever, Greg," I whispered, my voice steadying as I forced my brain into analytical mode. "But you're sloppy. You think that digital key is a win, but it's a beacon." I didn't wait for him to move. I kicked backward, my heel connecting sharply with his shin, and lunged for the server console. Greg yelped, stumbling back, but he didn't drop the blue decryption key. He scrambled to regain his footing, his eyes wild. "Elias!" I shouted into the dark. "Don't let him out of the lobby!" A shadow detached itself from the corner. Elias. He moved with a speed I hadn't seen in all the years he'd been my COO. He tackled Greg just as the man tried to bolt for the smashed glass of the front entrance. They slammed into the reception desk, the wood groaning under the weight. "The key, Sarah!" Elias barked, pinning Greg's arm to the marble. "He's trying to trigger the wipe sequence." I scrambled to the console. The screen was flashing a frantic amber warning. System integrity at 12%. Terminal lockdown in T-minus 60 seconds. The perpetrators had set a dead man's switch. If they didn't get what they wanted, they were going to incinerate the entire company's digital footprint, leaving me with nothing but a pile of lawsuits and a destroyed reputation. I began typing frantically, bypassing the primary administrative layers and digging into the raw kernel of the system. I had to create a firewall that would trick the system into thinking it had already executed the wipe while keeping the data intact. My fingers were a blur. One slip, one wrong keystroke, and the entire database would be shredded beyond recovery. 20 seconds, Elias yelled. He was wrestling with Greg, who had pulled a small, concealed tool, a modified hardware bypass, from his jacket and was aiming it at Elias's throat. "Drop it, Greg," I screamed, not looking up from the monitor. "If you kill him, the emergency protocols trigger an automatic lockdown that locks everyone inside this room for 48 hours. You'll be trapped here with me and the security teams that are already on their way." Greg hesitated, his eyes darting from me to the blinking red light above the door. "You're bluffing. You don't have the guts to lock us in." "Try me," I growled. I slammed the final command into the terminal. "Redirect output void." The monitor flashed green for a split second, then flickered. A high-pitched whine filled the room, so loud it felt like it was piercing my skull. The lobby lights erupted in a sudden, brilliant flash, followed by a total, absolute silence. The cooling fans died. The flickering monitors went dark. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the three of us. Greg pulled his arm back, his eyes wide as he looked at the dark screens. He looked down at the decryption key in his hand. It was dead. The pulsing blue light was gone. "You ruined it," Greg whispered, his face twisting in genuine terror. "They're going to kill me for this." "Who is they?" I stood up, smoothing down my jumpsuit, though my hands were shaking. Who paid you to burn my life to the ground? Before Greg could answer, the heavy, reinforced doors at the back of the lobby began to shudder. Someone was using a hydraulic ram. It wasn't the police. The rhythmic, heavy thuds were far too professional, far too aggressive. "They're not here for the data anymore," Elias said, his voice deathly pale as he stood up and straightened his tie, his gaze fixed on the reinforced doors that were already beginning to buckle. "They're here for the liability. They're coming to clean up the scene." "We have to get to the backup vault in the basement," I said, grabbing my emergency bag from behind the desk. "It's the only place with a hardline connection to the internal security board." "Sarah, look!" Elias pointed to the lobby wall. I followed his gaze. The screen that had been showing the evidence of my sabotage was flickering back to life. It wasn't showing the security footage anymore. It was showing a live broadcast of the street outside the building. Dozens of dark, unmarked vans had swarmed the plaza, and men in tactical gear were pouring out, moving with the precision of a professional, organized group. They weren't there to investigate a crime. They were there to suppress it. And as the camera zoomed in, I saw one of them hold up a tablet that displayed my face with a bright, red target overlay. The lobby floor suddenly vibrated as the basement access panels, the very place we needed to escape to, slammed shut with a final, booming resonance. We were trapped on the ground floor. The tactical team was seconds away from breaching the glass, and behind us, the wall safe clicked open, revealing not our documents, but a small, unassuming package that had been planted there while we were distracted. It was a timer, and it had 5 seconds left. The red digits on the small, metallic box inside the wall safe didn't just count down. They seemed to pulse and sync with the erratic thudding of my own heart. 4, 3, 2. My instincts, honed by years of surviving the shark tank of high-stakes tech, didn't freeze, they ignited. "Get down!" I screamed, lunging for Elias and tackling him behind the heavy granite structure of the reception desk. As we slammed into the cold floor, the device didn't explode with fire. Instead, it emitted a high-frequency sonic burst that shattered every piece of glass in the lobby. The sound was a physical weight, a piercing shriek that felt like it was rearranging my internal organs. I buried my face in my arms, my ears ringing with the violent force of the pulse. When the sound finally died, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. I pushed myself up, my vision swimming. The lobby was a wasteland of glass shards and smoke. Greg was nowhere to be seen. The coward had likely slipped away in the chaos. Elias was struggling to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his suit jacket torn. "We need to move," Elias wheezed, grabbing my shoulder. "The tactical team is going to breach in seconds." "The basement is locked," I spat, wiping soot from my face. "But the server room vent leads to the maintenance tunnel. If we can bypass the external override, we can make it to the parking garage." We sprinted through the debris, our footsteps crunching on the glass. As we reached the service hallway, the front doors of the building finally buckled inward. Through the haze of the lobby, I saw them. Men in matte black gear, their movements cold and calculated, holding equipment that looked like high-end signal jammers. They weren't police. They weren't even private security. They were a professional group designed for total erasure. We ducked into the service hallway just as a burst of light illuminated the lobby. I didn't look back. I reached the maintenance vent, pried the grate off with a desperate, adrenaline-fueled heave, and shoved Elias through. I followed, sliding into the cramped, dark, metallic space just as a suppressed weapon fired, the bullet pinging off the wall where my head had been a second before. We scrambled through the narrow tunnel, the smell of damp concrete and electricity filling the air. We finally reached the junction that led to the basement, but I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy industrial door at the end of the corridor was glowing red. A thermal torch was being applied from the other side. "They're ahead of us," I whispered, panic finally threatening to break my resolve. "How are they ahead of us?" Elias leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "They aren't just here to take the company, Sarah. They've compromised the building's entire infrastructure. They know every movement we make because they're tracking our biometrics through the smart floor sensors." The sensors, I realized, the blood draining from my face. "They're tracking our gait, our heart rates. We're giving them our location every time we take a step." "We have to stop moving," Elias said, his eyes scanning the tunnel. "We have to neutralize our own digital footprint." I looked at my watch, a custom device I'd helped design. I tapped the override, forcing it into a dead zone mode. It would cut off my connection to the building's grid, but it would also stop the sensors from logging my presence. I tossed it to Elias, and he did the same. We were now ghosts in our own house. We huddled in the darkness, listening to the muffled, rhythmic thuds of boots approaching from both ends of the maintenance tunnel. They were closing the pincer. I looked around the cramped space, searching for anything, a tool, a pipe, a distraction, anything to get us out. My hand brushed against a panel on the wall. It was the manual bypass for the building's atmospheric control. I looked at the panel, then at Elias. A dangerous plan began to form in my mind. If I dumped the fire suppression chemicals into the tunnel, it would create a localized, zero visibility zone. It would also trip the building's central alarm, effectively resetting the security logic and potentially unlocking the exit doors. "It's going to be a death trap for us too," I whispered. "The chemical is corrosive. We'll have seconds to get to the garage before it burns our lungs." Elias looked at me, a grim smile touching his lips. "I've had a good run, Sarah. Let's make them regret coming to this building." I reached for the lever, but as my fingers curled around the metal, a voice echoed through the tunnel. A voice that froze the blood in my veins. It was coming from the intercom, clear and cold, cutting through the static of the tunnel. "Stop right there, Sarah. We're not the ones you should be running from. Check your personal inbox. We've been waiting for you to realize that the person helping you escape is the same one who sold the keys to your front door." I spun around to look at Elias. He wasn't looking at me with support or desperation anymore. He was staring at the maintenance panel with a look of chilling, detached satisfaction. He wasn't waiting for us to escape. He was waiting for me to trigger the system. "You?" I breathed, my heart stopping. "Elias, tell me you didn't." He reached into his jacket, and instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the exact one I had thought was destroyed in the server room. "You were always the visionary, Sarah, but you never understood that in this business, ownership is just a temporary state of mind. And right now, your state of mind is about to be very, very permanent." He reached for the override lever himself, but before he could pull it, the tunnel floor began to shake with an intensity that threw us both to the ground. A voice, not one of the intruders, but someone else, boomed over the tunnel's emergency speakers. "System lockdown initiated by the board of directors. All exits sealed. Protocol Ghost activated." The walls began to compress. The maintenance tunnel wasn't just a hallway, it was a trap, and the entire structure was now shifting to crush everything inside. The sound of grinding metal was deafening, a monstrous screech as the building's structural integrity was manipulated by the very systems I had programmed to protect it. I looked at Elias, whose expression of cool detachment had shattered into a mask of pure panic. The master override he had been counting on had backfired. The board, the silent, high-level investors I hadn't seen in months, had initiated the Ghost Protocol. It was the ultimate failsafe, designed to vaporize everything inside the facility if it was ever deemed irrecoverable. "You idiot!" I shouted over the groan of collapsing walls. "You thought you were working for the competitors? They're not just taking the company, they're wiping the evidence of their own existence." Elias scrambled back, his composure gone. "Override it. You're the lead architect. You have to have a back door." "I don't have a back door for a total system purge." I lunged, not for the lever, but for his jacket. I snatched the encrypted drive from his hand. It wasn't just a copy of the stolen data. It was the master cryptographic key that tied the building's physical architecture to the private equity firm's secret offshore accounts. I didn't try to stop the building from closing. I embraced it. I sprinted toward the emergency maintenance hatch, a small, reinforced escape port I had insisted on installing against the advice of the original contractors. As the walls began to pinch the ceiling, I jammed the drive into the hatch's manual override. "Elias, if you want to live, grab the railing," I screamed. He didn't hesitate. We threw ourselves into the gap just as the maintenance tunnel folded like a crushed soda can behind us. We tumbled down a spiral gravity chute, hitting the bottom of the basement's subfloor with a bone-jarring thud. We were in the dead room, a lead-lined bunker buried beneath the foundation, the only place in the building immune to the electronic lockdown. Silence crashed back over us. The shaking stopped. We were trapped in the dark, but the air was still breathable. I scrambled to my feet, my breath ragged, and pulled a small, high-intensity flare from the emergency kit on the wall. The bright red light bathed the bunker in a hellish, pulsating glow. I checked the drive. It was intact. Then I pulled my secondary device, a sat phone I kept offline, completely disconnected from the building's compromised network. I initiated a broadcast. I wasn't calling the police. I was calling the Federal Regulatory Commission and the international news syndicates. I dumped the entire contents of the drive, the transaction logs, the secret emails, the proof of the ghost protocol, and the live footage of Elias and the tactical team inside the building. "It's over," I said, my voice cold, staring at Elias as he sat slumped in the corner, covered in dust and defeat. "The world is seeing everything right now. The tactical team, the sabotage, the board's attempt to kill us. You're not a consultant anymore, Elias. You're a witness." Within minutes, the sirens began to wail, not the building's internal alarm, but the wail of city emergency services. The sound of heavy doors being cut open from the outside echoed down the shaft. I waited until I heard voices, real, authorized law enforcement voices, before I triggered the hatch to open. The scene that followed was pure chaos. Federal agents swarmed the basement, their weapons drawn, but they weren't looking for me. They were looking for the men who had breached the lobby. I stepped out, covered in grime, holding the drive up like a trophy. A senior agent approached, his expression grim. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked. "I have the proof," I said, handing him the drive. "And I have the man who coordinated the breach." I pointed to Elias, who didn't even try to stand as the agents moved in to secure him. The aftermath was a whirlwind of interrogations and legal battles. The competitor who had hired Greg was a shell company tied directly to the same board members who had tried to trigger the ghost protocol. They had wanted to collect the insurance on the company, liquidate the assets, and hide their massive financial crimes under the guise of an unfortunate security breach. But they had underestimated the owner. In the weeks that followed, the company went through a radical transformation. I purged the entire management team, including the board members who had been caught in the digital dragnet. I rebuilt the security from the ground up, keeping it decentralized, transparent, and most importantly, under my sole, verifiable control. I kept my promise to myself. I walked into the lobby of the Apex Tower for the first time since the incident. It was different now, bright, open, and guarded by personnel I had handpicked myself. As I walked to the front desk, the new receptionist, a young woman who looked up with a genuine professional smile, stood up. "Good morning, Miss Jenkins," she said, her voice confident. "Everything is in order. We've been waiting for you." I looked around the lobby, the space that had nearly become my tomb, and felt a profound sense of peace. I had built this empire with my own hands, and I had protected it with my own blood. I didn't need to dress in a suit or wear a mask to prove who I was anymore. I took the elevator to the top floor, my reflection in the glass showing a woman who had been tested by fire and had come out the other side harder, sharper, and completely unshakable. I sat at my desk, looked out over the city, and opened my laptop. The red owner access light blinked softly, a steady, rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of a company that was finally, truly mine. I wasn't just the manager anymore. I was the one who decided who stayed, who went, and who would never, ever dare to try and take it from me again.